so now we're going to start talking about World War One. Britain, French, and Russia made up the Allies. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire made up the Central Powers. President Woodrow Wilson wanted to remain neutral during World War One, and although he wasn't directly involved with either party, he did lean more towards the Allies. And eventually, the U.S. did join the Allies because of three main reasons. First, Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare. This basically means that Germany blew up ships within the war zone near Britain, and in 1915 Germany actually destroyed the Lusitania, which was a luxury passenger liner that had 128 Americans along with other ethnicities as well. Wilson told Germany to stop destroying commercial ships, and Germany agreed for a while. So Wilson ran and won his second term in 1916 with the slogan that he kept us out of the war, meaning that Wilson basically kept America out of, from going into World War One. However, in 1917, Germany continued its submarine warfare. Another thing that contributed to the U.S. coming into the war was the Zimmermann telegram of 1917. It was basically a message from Germany to Mexico, and it was intercepted by America. The telegram basically was Germany who was offering Mexico its help in regaining New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona if Mexico agreed to form an alliance with Germany. And this enraged the U.S. and provoked Wilson to request Congress to officially declare war on Germany in 1917. Thus, America came into World War II in 1917. And soon after, in 1918, the U.S. Army came into the war. The war ended really quickly. Wilson actually offered his 14 points plan, which suggested reducing armaments, freedom of the seas, general association of nations, and a lot more. The last point in his 14 points plan was the formation of the League of Nations, which was basically a general association of nations who would basically work together to guarantee political independence of all nations. However, Wilson couldn't convince Congress to join the League of Nations. So, it was invented, but America, the person who was in charge of actually creating the League of Nations, that very nation wasn't part of the League of Nations. So, kind of ironic there. So in Paris, the Treaty of Versailles was created. It's basically setting the terms of peace and officially ending World War II with the Allies winning the war. The Treaty of Versailles established the League of Nations that Wilson proposed, but America was not part of it because Congress didn't like it because they thought it would obligate the U.S. to enter another world war. The Central Powers and Communist Russia also weren't allowed into the league because they were communist. Also, the treaty was also very tough on the losing Central Powers, particularly Germany. Germany had to give up land to the Allies, reduce its army and weaponry, pay war reparations to the Allies, and accept all blame for the cause of war. This was actually called Clause 231, otherwise known as the War Guilt Clause, and that really took a toll on Germany's pride and basically led to kind of just the complete destruction of Germany, especially during the 1920s, which is kind of why Hitler came to power, because the German people needed someone to provide them with that sense of hope, and that's what Hitler provided in the 1930s and 1940s. But I'll get to that later. Next, we're going to talk about the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties, basically, since the war was over, Warren G. Harding won the presidency with the motto of returning to normalcy. Returning to normalcy meant having peace in the U.S. again. Unfortunately, it also meant returning to the corruption that existed in the Gilded Age. The Teapot Dome scandal is the most important proof of corruption during Harding's presidency, in which Secretary of the Interior basically took bribes to allow certain oil companies drilling rights. Harding's administration loosely enforced a lot of the reform bills. The progressive era really strengthened, so it was kind of a reverse in progress. And as far as international affairs go, he chose to practice isolationism. After Harding, Calvin Coolidge became president. He's not really too important to know, Just know that he became president after Harding, and after Coolidge, Herbert Hoover became president. Hoover's pretty important, and I'll get to him in a little bit. But basically, I want you to know the Roaring Twenties is known for a couple of things. First of all, the 18th Amendment, which called for prohibition or the outlaw of alcohol. It was passed in the 1920s. Women and religious leaders were the main advocates of prohibition. Although their intentions were pure, the 18th Amendment actually led to underground smuggling of alcohol. The 19th Amendment was also invented in 1920, and it was passed, which basically gave women the right to vote. It granted women suffrage, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were very influential in making this actually happen. The movement called Black Nationalism started also in the 1920s. It started under the leadership of Marcus Garvey. Garvey basically believed in worldwide black unity. He espoused a Back to Africa plan and rejected the racial integration one. His program failed, and at the same time, members of the Ku Klux Klan exponentially increased because blacks were getting these rights. Since the turn of the century, thousands of people came from Europe. Now, with World War I done and Europe in shambles, even more people wanted to come to America. So the U.S. had to put up immigration quotas that significantly cut the number of immigrants allowed to enter. And these quotas basically lasted from 1919 to around the 1960s. Basically, during this time, no one from Europe was allowed in, which really wasn't good, especially during World War II, when a lot of the Jews from the Holocaust were trying to escape Europe and try to come to America. They couldn't because America had these immigration quotas up. Also, the Russian Revolution happened in Russia in 1917, which led to Russia becoming communist. America, which is a democracy, hated communism and was in constant fear of Russian spies coming to America and corrupting society during the 1920s. The Red Scare is the hysteria that resulted because of America's preoccupation with Russian spies. The Palmer raids were conducted by the Attorney General, Mitchell Palmer, where he basically violated constitutional rights in order to arrest suspected communists in America. Also, during the 1920s, you should remember the Scopes monkey trial of 1925 occurred, when basically a high school biology teacher by the name of John Scopes was taken to court for violating the Butler Act. In case you don't know, the Butler Act prohibited the teaching of evolution in school. Scopes was represented by Clarence Darrow, while the prosecution was represented by William Jennings Bryan. Remember, Bryan was the former presidential candidate. Scopes actually lost the case, but his lawyers overturned the verdict based on several technicalities. Since there were so many restrictions that took place in America during the 1920s, like immigration quotas and prohibition and banning evolution and the Palmer raids and so much more, because there were so many of these restrictions that took place, many of the novelists during the 1920s chose to move to Europe. And this group of novelists who chose to move to Europe during the 1920s is called the Lost Generation. The Lost Generation moved to enjoy obviously more freedom to express themselves as they wished. Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, and Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, and Sinclair Lewis's Babette, and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland are all examples of masterpieces that were written by the Lost Generation. Just a few more points. You should also remember that the Harlem Renaissance happened during the 1920s, and it was a result of African Americans thriving in the arts, in particular jazz. Jazz was born in the 1920s, and it was mainly through African American achievements. And lastly, you need to remember Henry Ford created the assembly line in the 1920s, which made production more efficient and contributed to the creation of an affordable car like the Ford Model T. And the efficiency that was a result of the assembly line allowed the cars to be sold for much cheaper prices and basically made cars much more affordable.